All right. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you're doing well. I want to talk with you about this book, Shanzhai, Deconstruction in Chinese by Byung-Chul. The book was translated to English by Philippa Hurd and published by MIT Press. So far, I think I've read about six, seven, eight, around that number of books by Byung-Chul. This book so far has been the most disappointing. I read it twice just to be sure. It might change. I doubt it, but let's get into why a little bit. So, jumping to page 61, I want to just read this little bit, two sentences for you. He writes, quote, "In spite of globalization, the Far East still seems to be the source of a great deal of surprise and confusion, which could release deconstructive energies. The Far East notion of identity is also very confusing to the Western observer." End quote. So, okay, it's fair enough. You get confused by how another culture, another language treats concepts that are familiar to you, but they have a different understanding of a different treatment of it. If you stay with that response of confusion, if you turn that confusion from a temporary response into a stable stance, if that confusion becomes your stance towards another culture, you would do something that Han does here in this book. He seems to be engaging with cultural material, but he is just repeatedly reinforcing a superficial, judgmental, caricature-like, very uniform treatment of a culture, namely the Chinese culture. So Han, in this book, essentially is arguing that deconstruction, the philosophical movement of deconstruction, or the style, the kind of philosophical work that we identify as deconstruction, that deconstruction is at home in Chinese culture, that the Chinese culture provides it with something like a native ground. What does that mean? It's not very obvious what that means, what that assertion, that something, an attitude, is at home in a language, it is at home, relatively speaking, in a culture, in a given culture. So what does that mean? Another question that I want to ask is, what is the opposite of deconstruction here? What is it that is presumably not at home? And what is it, the other thing, the opposite, which, in my understanding, when I think about the opposite of deconstruction, I usually think about hegemony. Is he implying that hegemony is at home in other cultures, what we call Western cultures, that hegemony is not at home in Chinese culture, or, more generally, according to Han, the Far East cultures? He is already in trouble when he treats culture as a unified space. It's very different. I mean, let's pay attention to this. It's one thing to say deconstruction is at home in a culture. It's a totally different thing to say that deconstruction is at home everywhere in that culture. Everywhere, it fits in. And I think he wants to say that everywhere, the second assertion. He wants to say everywhere in Chinese culture, deconstruction is at home. And that's just a silly thing to say. He says that concepts like originality, or the binary of original copy, that original copy binary, dichotomy, isn't really grasped in Chinese. Isn't grasped, or is it easier to put yourself in a frame of mind in Chinese language or in Chinese culture? Is it easier to put yourself in a frame of mind where that distinction becomes, for a time, unimportant? I mean, I wouldn't have that big of a problem if he says that second thing, but I am saying the second thing, that in a culture, you can name the culture you want, some things become easier because those cultures enable us to more easily put ourselves in a frame of mind where certain concepts become more easily grasped, or certain distinctions become unimportant or become important. If we say that we are treating culture as heterogeneous, as having distinct regions, and you move from one region to another region of a culture to do something. Let me read you one more passage from page 78. He writes, quote, "The Chinese clearly see no contradiction between capitalism and Marxism." Clearly, according to him, the Chinese clearly see no contradiction between capitalism and Marxism. Clearly. Okay, I'm overemphasizing that. He goes on to say, "Indeed, contradiction is not a Chinese concept. Chinese thought tends more towards both and than either or." Okay, so he goes from saying that concept is not a Chinese concept to it tends more towards, so he's like hedging a little bit, softening his claim. Tending more towards both and is different from saying all they have is both and. They have no either or. This kind of claim is very sophomoric. This is something that you might expect from a first year, second year philosophy student, but not from Byung-Chul. I mean, I'm almost embarrassed that I ever liked anything else that he has written elsewhere. I'm still interested in him, but for whatever reason, he has made a blunder with this book. I mean, it's interesting. Some of the things that he is doing in this book, the detail of his work, the details are interesting, but the overarching moves, the overarching claims, and the more general sensibility and his stance is really strange and very, very cartoonish. I'm having a hard time believing that he is not joking. One of the chapters towards the end of the book is devoted to the concept of Shanzhai, which is also the title of the book. And this concept is defined loosely as innovative copying. Copying an original, but in an innovative way. You copy while you add some flourishes, some innovations. The root of this concept goes back to when Chinese manufacturers or people who created phones, they started to make copies of well-known mobile devices. That they were lookalikes, but some of them had these new features. The basis of the product, the basis of the object was something else. So when he's talking about this, Han compares Chinese culture of creativity and kind of opportunism to nature. And he says, look, nature creates in this way. Nature creates abundantly, and the fundamental principle in its creation is copying with small variations. I mean, the comparison with nature is a classic sign of prejudice. It's a classic sign of, oh, look at those more natural beings. I refer you to this beautiful essay by Hayden White called "Noble Savage as Fetish." In the essay, it's one of those places where it becomes clear that even the compliments paid at people who are natural, they are closer to nature in their ways, in their playfulness. Even when we romanticize them, we are being condescending to them. What is the consequence of this treatment? Is he saying that our cultures or Western cultures are able to appreciate contradiction and deconstruction? Both. We have both. We have the ability to grasp contradictions, and we can deconstruct identities and differences. Those like stable treatments of categories. We can have both, and we can do both self-consciously. But this other culture only has access to one of those, and that access is not a very self-aware access. It's a native access because it is a natural place. Deconstruction is at home in this other culture because it's a more natural. It's closer to nature. It's a more natural way to be. I emphasize this is combined with Chinese culture being presented as uniform, as fundamentally foreign, confusing, surprising, at the same time as opportunistic, a little bit aggressive, at the same time as playful, as natural. From our perspective, it's contradictory, but from our perspective, it's not really engaging with the plurality within culture. So it's a cartoon book, really. It reminds me of those cartoon introductions to deconstruction, like a very friendly beginner's guide to deconstruction that is with the help of cartoon. But unfortunately, he's cartooning, he's making caricatures and cartoons of a culture that really deserves to be treated with more nuance, with more care. So I would say Han has his moments of insight and poetry, as usual in this book, but I wouldn't take what he says about Chinese culture seriously. There's an article written by Professor Ruyu Hang, who, at least at the time of writing that article, was at National Chiayi University in Taiwan. One of her articles, it's titled "To Be as Not to Be: In Search of an Alternative Humanism in the Light of Early Daoism and Deconstruction." So in that article, one of the things that she does is she shows that deconstruction is also an achievement in Chinese culture, in the history of philosophy, history of thought in Chinese culture. They also achieved deconstruction self-consciously in a way that responded to certain problems of Confucianism, Confucian philosophy. So she borrows from Giorgio Agamben and the concept of anthropological machine, which is a way of describing the drive towards cultural hegemony. So let's read from Ru Yuhang's article. She writes, quote, "The Confucian version of anthropological machine works to produce the human and the non-human. The human is the filial, loyal subject, and the non-human is the disobedient beast, natural beast. There has been wide acknowledgement that Confucianism is an ethical humanism. One of its most important concerns is how to become a true human. I cannot help but wonder if the so-called Confucian true human being, is truly humane or just when he or she is on the side of attacking, punishing, and excluding the barbarians, the so-called barbarians. If the Confucian human being is a part of the anthropological machine which works to attack, punish, divide, and exclude the other, this version of humanism has to be questioned or deconstructed because it turns into a pretext of authoritarianism on the political level and foundationism on the ontological level." End quote. So see, she is motivating. She is teaching us about the motivations internal in the Chinese history and culture for the emergence of what we might describe as deconstructive tendencies, a deconstructive style of criticism. And if you go with Han, you will miss this, and you mistakenly will see deconstruction as being a kind of native tendency, which then can be taken as excuse for, complete disregard of some ethical principles and a complete detachment from the rest of the world in terms of things like copyright laws. All right, I'll stop there. Wouldn't recommend this book unless you're curious. And thank you for listening. Otherwise, I will speak with you next time.